You are not stuck because you lack discipline. You are stuck because your system was never trained to continue once progress slows down. If you look at your history honestly, the pattern is consistent. You get excited quickly. You learn fast at the beginning. You feel alive when something is new. Then the curve flattens. Improvement slows. Feedback disappears. What once felt effortless starts to feel heavy. That is when you leave. Not dramatically, sometimes quietly, sometimes with a rational explanation, sometimes by telling yourself you'll come back later. But the result is always the same. Another interest abandoned, another skill half-built, another confirmation that something is wrong with you. Over time, this creates a specific identity. Someone who starts but does not finish. Someone who is curious but inconsistent. Someone who has potential but never cashes it in. This book is written for that exact pattern, not to motivate you, not to convince you to try harder, not to fix your mindset. Those approaches fail because they attack the surface. This book solves a different problem. Why your brain systematically withdraws energy the moment learning stops being rewarding, and how to retrain it so continuation becomes automatic instead of heroic. By the end, you will understand why quitting was never a moral failure. It was a predictable biological response. And more importantly, you will know how to change the one variable that determines whether you stop or continue when boredom, friction, or uncertainty appear. The transformation is not emotional, it is operational. You will stop relying on motivation. You will stop negotiating with yourself. You will stop needing excitement to act. You will become someone for whom continuing is no longer a decision, but the default response. Not because you forced yourself, but because your system learned, through evidence, that stopping is no longer the correct answer. This book is about building that inevitability. Before you continue, do one practical thing. Save this video. This is not content you consume in one pass and forget. Each chapter builds on the previous one. If you stop midway and never return, the system this book is designed to change will remain exactly as it is. If you can't listen to everything today, that's fine. Mark the chapter where you stop. Come back tomorrow. Continue from that exact point. Do not restart. Do not skip ahead. Progress here is sequential, not motivational. If you follow it in order and give each chapter time to land, the effect is not temporary insight. It is structural change, not because of inspiration, but because your understanding and eventually your behavior will no longer be optional. Chapter 1. The fundamental error. The mistake most people make is not failing to act. The mistake is believing that action is the starting point. From that belief, everything else collapses. When people try to explain why they quit, they point to surface-level variables: focus, discipline, confidence, motivation, talent. These explanations feel intuitive because they are visible. You can feel low motivation. You can notice distraction. You can measure inconsistency. But visibility is not causality. Those variables are not drivers. They are readouts. They are indicators produced by a deeper system that has already made its decision. When you say, "I lost motivation," what you are actually describing is that your brain stopped allocating energy to a task. When you say, "I wasn't disciplined," what you are observing is that continuation exceeded the system's tolerance for cost without reward. These are not character flaws. They are system outcomes. The fundamental error is treating quitting as a conscious choice instead of a predictable withdrawal. Once you make that error, every solution you attempt becomes misaligned. You apply pressure where adaptation is required. You demand effort where conditioning is missing. You try to override biology with language. That never works for long. The brain does not respond to advice. It responds to evidence. And the evidence most people accumulate, unknowingly, teaches a single lesson. Stopping works. Stopping reduces discomfort. Stopping restores stimulation. Stopping lowers cognitive load. Stopping resolves uncertainty. So the system learns, not intellectually, but physiologically. It learns that when friction appears, withdrawal is the correct move. From the outside, this looks like inconsistency. From the inside, it is efficiency. This is why moral explanations fail. Calling yourself lazy or undisciplined assumes that effort is the missing ingredient. But effort is not missing. It is being withheld because the system predicts a poor return. The brain is not broken. It is economical. It constantly answers one question. Is this worth the energy right now? That answer is not verbal. It is automatic. And once it is negative, motivation does not fade gradually. It drops. This is why people are confused by their own behavior. One week, they feel driven, curious, alive. The next week, they feel indifferent or resistant, even though nothing external has changed. What changed was not the goal. What changed was the prediction. Early in any pursuit, progress is rapid, feedback is dense, improvement is obvious. The system receives frequent signals that energy is being converted into gain. Under those conditions, action feels easy, not because you are disciplined, but because the system is being rewarded for continuing. Then the curve flattens. Learning slows. Feedback becomes sparse. Errors increase. The same effort produces less visible improvement. From the system's perspective, cost is rising while return is falling. At that moment, withdrawal is rational. This is the moment most people misinterpret. They think something went wrong. They think the interest was false. They think they chose the wrong path. They think they lack perseverance. They don't realize they have entered the most important phase of the process, the point where continuation is no longer supported by reward. That point reveals the true structure of the system. If continuation depends on feeling good, it will fail. If continuation depends on novelty, it will fail. If continuation depends on motivation, it will fail. Not eventually, predictably. This is not pessimism, it is mechanics. A system trained to act only when reinforced cannot suddenly act without reinforcement. That capacity must be built, and most people never build it. Instead, they rotate inputs. New goals, new plans, new identities, new promises. Each restart recreates the same early conditions: novelty, rapid learning, dopamine, hope. And each restart ends at the same place. Over time, the system accumulates a different kind of evidence, not about the task, but about the self. I don't finish. I always lose interest. I can't stick with things. This is not a belief chosen consciously. It is inferred from repeated outcomes. The system is simply updating its model. That model becomes identity. Identity, in this sense, is not a story you tell yourself. It is a set of expectations about what happens when effort continues past comfort. Those expectations shape emotion before thought appears. By the time you decide to quit, the decision has already been made at a deeper level. Thought arrives late, offering justification for an outcome that is already in motion. This is why trying to reason your way into consistency fails. Reasoning addresses the narrative layer. Quitting occurs at the allocation layer. The tragedy is not that people quit. The tragedy is that they interpret quitting incorrectly. They blame themselves instead of the system. They apply pressure instead of redesign. They seek motivation instead of evidence. Every failed attempt strengthens the wrong identity. Every abandoned project reinforces the prediction that continuation leads to loss. Eventually, even starting feels heavier, not because of fear, but because the system has learned the full arc. It knows how this ends. At that point, people describe themselves as burned out, bored, or apathetic. In reality, they are well trained, just trained in the wrong direction. The purpose of this book is not to stop you from quitting through force. Force does not reprogram systems. It creates resistance. The purpose is to expose the exact mechanism that makes quitting inevitable under certain conditions, and then to show how to alter those conditions so continuation becomes the path of least resistance. But that requires precision. You cannot fix a system you misdiagnose. You cannot train what you cannot see, and you cannot change identity by arguing with it. Before any protocol, before any technique, before any action, the error must be corrected. You did not fail because you lacked discipline. You failed because your system was never trained to operate once reward disappeared. Everything that follows builds from that correction. In the next chapter, you will understand why identity is not a personality trait or a story you tell yourself, but a prediction system built from evidence, and how that system quietly determines what feels possible, exhausting, or inevitable before you ever try. Chapter 2. Identity is not a story. It is a prediction system. Most people think identity is something they believe about themselves. I'm disciplined. I'm creative. I'm inconsistent. I'm the kind of person who gives up. They treat these as descriptions, narratives, self-talk. That framing is wrong. Identity is not descriptive. It is predictive. It does not explain who you are. It predicts what will happen when effort is required, uncertainty appears, or reward is delayed. Your system is constantly asking a single question, without words. What usually happens if I keep going? The answer to that question determines everything downstream. It determines your emotional baseline before you think. It determines whether friction feels tolerable or threatening. It determines whether action feels heavy or automatic. By the time conscious thought appears, the prediction has already been made. This is why affirmations fail. You can tell yourself you are disciplined, capable, focused. But if the system predicts loss, boredom, or futility, those words carry no weight. Language cannot override accumulated evidence. Identity is built from outcomes, not intentions. Every time you continue despite discomfort, the system records data. Every time you stop to relieve discomfort, the system records data. Over time, patterns emerge, not consciously, but statistically. The system does not remember your reasons. It remembers correlations. Effort followed by relief trains one identity. Effort followed by neutrality or quiet progress trains another. This is not about confidence. Confidence is a feeling. Identity is an expectation. If your history shows that pushing through leads to diminishing returns, confusion, or loss of stimulation, the system predicts threat. Withdrawal becomes protective. If your history shows that continuing through flat periods does not result in harm, the system predicts safety. Action becomes available. The critical insight is this: identity is not who you want to be. It is who your nervous system expects you to be. And expectations are built through repetition. This is why trying to become someone new through decision alone fails. Decisions are discrete. Identity is cumulative. People often say, "I know what I should do, I just don't do it." That sentence reveals the gap. Knowledge exists at the cognitive layer. Identity operates at the predictive layer. You are not failing to execute a plan. You are obeying a forecast. That forecast was not chosen. It was learned. And like all learned systems, it can only be changed by new data. This is where most self-improvement collapses. People attempt to update identity with explanations, insights, and intentions. They confuse understanding with evidence. Understanding is inert, evidence is active. Your system does not update when you agree with an idea. It updates when an action produces a result that contradicts its expectation. That is the only mechanism available. This is also why change feels unstable at first. When new actions contradict old predictions, The system experiences uncertainty. Uncertainty is metabolically expensive. The system resists not because change is bad, but because prediction error is uncomfortable. Most people interpret that discomfort as a sign they are doing something wrong. They retreat. The old prediction survives. Identity remains intact. To change identity, you must do something very specific. Repeatedly act in a way that violates the old prediction without triggering excessive threat. Too little contradiction produces no update. Too much contradiction produces shutdown. This is not philosophy. It is calibration. Identity changes when the system is exposed to small, repeatable evidence that continuing is survivable even when reward is absent. Not exciting, not dramatic, survivable. This is why heroic effort backfires. It overwhelms the system, associates effort with pain, and strengthens the prediction that pushing leads to damage. The system is not impressed by intensity. It is trained by consistency. This also explains why people relapse into old patterns even after breakthroughs. A single successful sprint does not outweigh years of opposite evidence. The system averages over time. Identity is conservative by design. It does not update because you want it to. It updates when the cost of maintaining the old model exceeds the cost of adopting a new one. Your task is not to convince yourself of who you are. Your task is to supply the system with undeniable low-threat evidence. Until then, motivation will remain unreliable, discipline will feel forced, and quitting will feel like relief. Once identity shifts, the opposite happens. Action feels lighter. Continuation feels normal. Stopping feels strange. Not because you changed your mindset, because the prediction changed. Everything that follows in this book is about engineering that shift deliberately rather than accidentally. But before that can happen, one more misunderstanding must be removed. The belief that the brain is designed to pursue success, fulfillment, or self-actualization. It is not. It is designed to conserve energy. And that design explains far more of your behavior than any personality label ever will. In the next chapter, you will understand why the brain does not optimize for achievement or happiness, but for energy efficiency, and how that single principle explains both rapid enthusiasm and sudden collapse. Chapter 3. The brain does not optimize for success. It optimizes for energy. Most people assume their brain is aligned with their goals. They believe it wants achievement, growth, mastery, fulfillment. When they fail to act in accordance with those goals, they assume something went wrong internally. Lack of willpower, lack of desire, lack of discipline. This assumption is false. The brain does not care about success. It does not care about meaning. It does not care about your long-term plans. It cares about energy. More precisely, it cares about minimizing energy expenditure while maintaining survivability. Everything else, motivation, curiosity, ambition, boredom, is downstream of that objective. This matters because once you understand this, many confusing behaviors stop looking like sabotage and start looking like optimization. Starting new things feels easy not because you are inspired, but because early learning is cheap. The return on energy is high. A small investment produces visible progress. The system approves continued allocation. Staying with things becomes difficult, not because you are weak, but because the return on energy declines. Progress slows. Feedback becomes ambiguous. Errors increase. From the system's perspective, the same input now produces less output. At that point, withdrawal is logical. The system is not asking, will this make me great in 5 years? It is asking, is this worth the energy right now? Those are very different questions. This is why long-term reasoning loses to short-term relief. Long-term outcomes are abstract. Energy costs are immediate. The system prioritizes the concrete over the conceptual. You can intellectually value mastery. You can emotionally want consistency. But if the energy equation turns negative, action will stall, not because you decided to quit, because the system stopped funding the operation. This is also why discipline feels unnatural for most people. Discipline is action taken despite an unfavorable energy equation. It requires a circuit that allows effort without immediate reward. That circuit is not default. It must be trained. Without it, the brain behaves exactly as expected. It seeks novelty, stimulation, and relief, because those reliably restore energy balance. This is where many people misunderstand themselves. They think they are addicted to distraction. They think they lack focus. They think they are lazy. In reality, they are responding to environments that offer rapid energy normalization. Social media, sugar, short videos, constant novelty. These are not indulgences. They are efficient tools for restoring stimulation with minimal effort. The brain is doing its job. The problem is not that the brain seeks efficiency. The problem is that most meaningful pursuits are inefficient in the short term. They require sustained effort with delayed or invisible payoff. From an energy perspective, they are bad deals until the system is trained to tolerate them. This creates a structural conflict. Modern environments reward rapid energy recovery. Deep work, learning, and mastery demand prolonged energy investment. Without adaptation, the system will always choose the cheaper option. This is why advice fails. Just push through. Think about the future. Stay disciplined. These suggestions assume that understanding future value is enough to override present cost. It is not. The brain does not discount effort using logic. It discounts it using experience. If effort has historically led to boredom, frustration, or abandonment, the system predicts loss. It resists. If effort has historically been paired with survivable discomfort and eventual normalization, the system allows it. Again, this is not moral, it is statistical. The system learns from what happens, not from what you intend. This also explains why people oscillate between extremes. Intense bursts of effort, followed by collapse. Grand plans, followed by apathy. Intensity creates a spike in perceived importance, temporarily justifying high energy expenditure. But because it is unsustainable, it leads to depletion and negative association. The system updates. High effort equals damage. Next time, resistance appears earlier. Over time, even moderate effort feels heavy. The system is protecting itself from predicted cost. This is how people become unmotivated without understanding why. Motivation did not disappear. It was withdrawn. The brain concluded that the investment no longer made sense. Until you accept this framing, you will keep fighting yourself. You will try to force a system that is optimized for efficiency to behave as if it were optimized for aspiration. That mismatch is the source of chronic frustration. The solution is not to demand more from the system. The solution is to retrain what the system considers tolerable. You do not convince an energy optimizer with words. You train it with exposure. That training does not start with ambition. It starts with understanding where energy is lost, why it is lost, and how withdrawal becomes the default response. Only then can continuation be rebuilt as a low-threat, acceptable action. But to do that, one critical component must be understood clearly: dopamine, not as a buzzword, not as motivation, but as the signal that tells the system whether energy investment was justified. In the next chapter, you will understand what dopamine actually measures, why novelty creates false momentum, and how the same signal that fuels curiosity quietly engineers abandonment. Chapter 4. The Knowledge Instinct and the Addiction to Rate of Learning. Some minds are not driven by mastery, they are driven by acceleration. These minds feel most alive when uncertainty collapses quickly, when patterns reveal themselves fast, when each unit of effort produces a noticeable increase in understanding. The reward is not depth. The reward is velocity. This is not a flaw. It is an orientation. You can call it curiosity, but that word is too soft. What is actually operating is a pressure to reduce uncertainty at speed, a need to move from "I don't know" to "I see it" as efficiently as possible. This creates a specific internal reward structure. The system does not ask, "How good am I becoming?" It asks, "How fast am I learning?" As long as the answer is fast, energy flows easily. This is why beginnings feel intoxicating. Early stages are dense with information. Every small action yields insight. Progress is obvious. The learning curve is steep. The system receives constant confirmation that energy is being converted into knowledge efficiently. Dopaminergic signals fire. Attention locks in. Time compresses. This is not discipline, it is alignment. But this same orientation contains the seed of collapse. Once the basic structure is learned, uncertainty drops. The rate of new information slows. Progress becomes incremental instead of explosive. Understanding deepens, but novelty disappears. From the outside, this looks like growth. From the inside, it feels like starvation. The system does not register depth as reward. It registers change. When change slows, the signal weakens. When the signal weakens, energy allocation drops. This is the moment many people misinterpret as boredom or loss of interest. In reality, it is a mismatch between the system's reward criteria and the current phase of learning. The task did not become wrong. The system became understimulated. Minds optimized for rate of learning confuse this signal with meaning. They assume that loss of excitement means loss of fit, that difficulty means misalignment, that resistance means error. So they search for a new beginning. A new domain resets the curve. Uncertainty returns. Learning accelerates. The system is rewarded again. This creates a recognizable pattern. Wide interests, shallow execution, repeated restarts. Society labels this as lack of commitment. But commitment was never the missing piece. The system was never trained to operate when learning becomes slow. This is why intelligence often makes the problem worse. Fast learners reach the plateau sooner. They extract obvious patterns quickly. They exhaust novelty early. They collide with diminishing returns faster than others. And because they are used to rapid feedback, the contrast is sharper. What feels like stagnation is not stagnation. It is normalization. Every skill, every domain, every craft passes through this phase. The difference is not whether the plateau appears, but how the system interprets it. If the system equates reward with velocity, the plateau feels like punishment. If the system can tolerate low novelty, the plateau becomes neutral. This distinction is everything. The goal is not to eliminate the knowledge instinct. It is not to suppress curiosity. Those are assets. The goal is to decouple action from rate of learning. As long as action depends on rapid insight, continuation will always be fragile. It will collapse the moment learning slows, which is exactly when depth begins. This is why people accumulate introductions instead of foundations. They know a little about many things and deeply about nothing, not because they chose that path, but because their system never crossed the phase boundary where reward disappears. That boundary is not crossed by understanding it. It is crossed by training a different circuit. Until that happens, the system will continue to chase steep curves and abandon flat runs. Not out of choice, but out of conditioning. The mistake is not being curious. The mistake is allowing curiosity to be the sole driver of action. Curiosity is volatile. Rate of learning is temporary. Novelty always decays. If continuation is not supported independently of those signals, abandonment is guaranteed. The question is not how to stay excited. The question is how to act when excitement is gone. To answer that, one more mechanism must be understood clearly. Why dopamine rises sharply at the beginning, why it collapses at the plateau, and why that collapse feels like a signal to stop. In the next chapter, you will see how dopamine actually works, why it responds to prediction error rather than achievement, and how the same signal that fuels early momentum engineers the urge to quit. Chapter 5. Dopamine is not motivation. It is a measurement system. Most people talk about dopamine as if it were fuel. They say things like, "I lost dopamine," "I need more dopamine," or "dopamine makes you motivated." This language is misleading. It causes people to chase stimulation instead of understanding what the signal actually does. Dopamine does not push you forward. It evaluates whether moving forward was worth it. It is not the gas pedal. It is the accounting system. Specifically, dopamine measures one thing: the difference between what you expected and what you actually got. This difference is known as reward prediction error. If reality exceeds expectation, dopamine rises. If reality matches expectation, dopamine stabilizes. If reality falls short, dopamine drops. The signal is not emotional, it is informational. It tells the system whether its model of the world needs updating. This distinction explains almost everything that feels confusing about motivation. At the beginning of any new pursuit, expectations are low and outcomes are high. You do not know much, so every insight feels significant. Every small improvement exceeds prediction. Dopamine spikes. This spike is often misinterpreted as passion. It is not passion, it is prediction error. Your system is not saying this matters deeply. It is saying this is yielding more than expected. As long as that gap exists, energy flows easily, attention sharpens, effort feels light, time compresses. But this state is temporary by design. As learning progresses, expectations rise. The system updates its model. What once felt impressive becomes normal. Improvement continues, but it no longer exceeds prediction. The dopamine signal does not rise anymore. It flattens. Nothing is wrong at this stage. This is the intended trajectory of learning. But here is the critical detail most people miss. When the signal flattens, the system does not interpret that as neutral. It interprets it as a warning. From the system's perspective, energy is still being spent, but the informational return has declined. The same input now produces less surprise, less update, less justification. So dopamine does not simply stabilize, it often drops. This drop is not dramatic, but it is decisive. When dopamine falls below baseline, the system begins to reallocate energy. Attention wanders, resistance appears, discomfort increases. Tasks that once felt effortless begin to feel heavy. This is the moment people describe as boredom, loss of interest, or burnout. But again, those are surface descriptions. What is actually happening is that the system has stopped receiving evidence that the investment is worthwhile. The brain does not say, "I hate this now." It says, "This is no longer a good trade." That interpretation is mechanical. And because dopamine is upstream of conscious thought, the urge to stop feels intuitive, obvious, and justified. Rationalizations appear afterward. "I guess this wasn't for me. I'm not feeling it anymore. I should do something more aligned." These explanations feel true because they are constructed on top of a biological signal that already decided. This is why people are shocked by their own inconsistency. They remember how excited they were at the beginning. They assume that excitement reflected something real about their values or potential. They don't realize they were responding to a temporary signal. Dopamine does not care about depth. It does not care about mastery. It does not care about long-term payoff. It cares about surprise. This creates a dangerous illusion. The early phase of learning feels meaningful not because it is meaningful, but because it is unpredictable. Once predictability increases, meaning seems to evaporate, even though real value is just beginning to form. This is where many intelligent, curious people get trapped. They unconsciously require a positive prediction error to continue. When that disappears, they interpret the absence as a sign to stop. Over time, the system learns a powerful association. When dopamine drops, withdrawal follows. This association becomes automatic. The moment learning slows, the urge to escape appears, not as panic, but as indifference, not as fear, but as apathy. That is more dangerous. Apathy does not feel like a problem. It feels like clarity. This is why people rarely fight it. They assume their motivation simply ran out. In reality, the system is enforcing a learned rule. Do not invest energy where return is no longer surprising. This rule is efficient for survival. It is disastrous for mastery. Mastery exists almost entirely beyond the point of novelty. Every deep skill, every complex domain, every meaningful craft spends the majority of its life in low prediction error territory. Progress is slow, feedback is subtle, gains are delayed. Without a separate circuit that allows action to continue without dopaminergic reinforcement, the system will always exit at this phase. Not sometimes, always. This is why relying on excitement is fatal. Excitement is an artifact of ignorance. It disappears precisely when competence begins. This is also why chasing dopamine makes the problem worse. When people respond to the drop by increasing stimulation, checking phones, switching tasks, seeking novelty, they teach the system that escape restores reward. Dopamine rebounds, not from progress, but from interruption. The association strengthens. Stop. Feel better. Over time, even small dips trigger withdrawal. The system becomes hypersensitive. Tolerance to flatness collapses. Eventually, the person does not just quit hard things. They avoid starting them. This is how potential erodes without trauma, not through failure, through misinterpretation of a signal. Dopamine was never telling you to stop. It was telling you that learning had entered a different phase. But because no one trained you for that phase, your system treated the signal as an exit cue. The solution is not to eliminate dopamine or suppress curiosity. The solution is to build a system that can act when dopamine is silent. That requires training a different mechanism, one that activates precisely when reward disappears. That mechanism is not abstract. It is not philosophical. It is anatomical. And until it is strengthened, every strategy you try will collapse at the same point. In the next chapter, you will see the full abandonment cycle laid out step by step, from initial excitement to withdrawal, and understand why quitting feels inevitable rather than chosen once dopamine drops. Chapter 6. The abandonment cycle is not a phase, it is a loop. Most people believe quitting happens because something interrupts the process. They think circumstances changed, motivation faded, life got busy, the interest stopped making sense. Quitting feels like a response to an external shift. That interpretation is comforting and wrong. Abandonment is not a break in the system. It is the system completing its loop. Once you understand dopamine as a measurement signal and energy as the governing currency, the pattern becomes obvious. The cycle begins with novelty. A new pursuit presents high uncertainty. The system does not know what to expect. Early actions produce large informational gains. Prediction error is positive. Dopamine rises. Under these conditions, attention feels effortless. Focus feels natural. The person does not need discipline because the system is being rewarded for engagement. This is often mistaken for alignment or passion, but novelty is unstable. By definition, it decays. As basic patterns are learned, uncertainty drops. Progress becomes less dramatic. The same actions now produce smaller updates. Prediction error declines. This is the inflection point. From the outside, it looks like progress. From the inside, it feels like loss. The dopamine signal flattens or dips. Energy allocation tightens. Resistance appears. This resistance is subtle at first. The task feels slightly heavier. Distraction becomes tempting. Procrastination shows up. The person interprets this as a problem with themselves or with the task. They begin to evaluate. Maybe this isn't for me. Maybe I chose wrong. I'm not enjoying this anymore. These thoughts are not causes. They are post hoc justifications. The system already reduced funding. If the person has no capacity to continue without reinforcement, the next step is inevitable. Withdrawal. Withdrawal does not always look like quitting. Often it is partial. Skipping sessions, reducing intensity, replacing deep work with shallow engagement, multitasking. These behaviors temporarily restore stimulation. Dopamine rebounds, not because of progress, but because of relief. The system learns a powerful lesson. Stopping works. This is negative reinforcement. Discomfort is removed, so the behavior that removed it is strengthened. At this point, the loop closes. The next time the person encounters friction, whether in the same domain or a new one, the system predicts the arc in advance. It anticipates the drop. Resistance appears earlier. What once took months to reach now takes weeks. What took weeks now takes days. Eventually, it happens at the thought of starting. This is how abandonment accelerates over time, not because the person becomes weaker, but because the system becomes better trained. Each loop tightens the prediction: effort, discomfort, withdrawal, relief. The system does not care that the withdrawal cost you progress, opportunity, or self-respect. It only registers that energy balance was restored. This is why quitting feels rational in the moment, and why it feels hollow later. The hollow feeling comes from a different layer. It is not the system that withdrew. It is the observing mind noticing a pattern it cannot interrupt. This creates confusion and self-blame. People think, why do I keep doing this? They assume inconsistency is a flaw. In reality, they are watching a learned loop execute flawlessly. The most dangerous aspect of this cycle is that it disguises itself as insight. Loss of interest feels like clarity. Boredom feels like truth. Apathy feels like honesty. Because the dopaminergic signal dropped, the mind assumes the task lost meaning. Meaning did not disappear. Stimulation did. But the system does not distinguish between the two. This is why people accumulate beginnings instead of outcomes. Each new start feels justified. Each exit feels necessary. From the outside, it looks like scattered ambition. From the inside, it feels like responsiveness. The loop is invisible because it operates below language, and as long as it remains invisible, it remains in control. The critical realization is this: once the loop is established, quitting is no longer a decision point. It is a reflex. Reflexes are not debated. They are executed. Trying to reason at that stage is like arguing with a knee-jerk. The signal has already traveled. This is why insight alone does not fix the problem. Understanding the cycle intellectually does not prevent it from running. The system does not update because it understands the loop. It updates when the loop is interrupted at the point of withdrawal. That interruption must be precise. Too weak, and the system does not register a difference. Too strong, and it triggers threat and avoidance. Most people fail here because they attempt extremes. Either they quit as usual, or they force themselves far beyond. Tolerance. Both reinforce the same prediction. Effort is costly. The loop remains intact. To break it, you need a way to continue without overwhelming the system, while still violating the expectation that discomfort always leads to stopping. That requires redefining what continuation looks like, not pushing through, not powering forward, but advancing just enough to produce new evidence. This is the hinge. And it is here that most advice collapses because it misunderstands what the system needs to see. Before we get to the intervention, one more distinction must be made. Not everyone exits the loop at the same point. Some people tolerate the plateau, others flee it. The difference is not talent, intelligence, or ambition. It is tolerance for acting without reward. In the next chapter, you will see why the plateau is the true dividing line between mastery and abandonment, and why what looks like boredom is actually the moment identity is decided. Chapter 7. The plateau is not a problem, it is the filter. Every meaningful pursuit contains a phase where progress becomes quiet. Improvement continues, but it is no longer obvious. Errors become subtler. Gains take longer to notice. Feedback thins out. The curve flattens. This phase is universal. It appears in learning, training, building, writing, studying, creating. It does not signal failure, it signals transition. But most systems are not built to survive it. The plateau is not where people struggle. It is where systems reveal what they are optimized for. Up to this point, novelty carried the load. Dopamine justified effort. Learning felt efficient. The system was being paid to continue. At the plateau, that payment stops. Energy is still required, but reward is no longer immediate. From the system's perspective, this is the first moment where effort is demanded without proof of return. That is why the plateau feels different, not harder in an absolute sense, but riskier. The system cannot tell whether continued investment will pay off. Uncertainty returns, but without the excitement of novelty. This is the most expensive cognitive state. Effort plus ambiguity. What happens next depends entirely on what the system has been trained to do under those conditions. There are two broad responses. One system interprets the plateau as information. It treats reduced feedback as a normal phase. It continues acting not because it feels good, but because it has learned that discomfort without reward is survivable. The other system interprets the plateau as error. It treats friction as a signal that something is wrong. It withdraws to restore stimulation and certainty. From the outside, these look like personality differences. One person is disciplined, the other is inconsistent. From the inside, they are simply following different predictions. The first system predicts that continuing through flatness does not cause harm. The second predicts that flatness leads to waste or threat. Neither prediction is innate, both are learned. This is why the plateau is the real filter, not intelligence, not talent, not ambition. Tolerance for acting without reinforcement. Most people never train this tolerance. Their entire history teaches them that effort should feel rewarding or it is not worth doing. School rewards grades. Work rewards output. Media rewards attention instantly. Very few environments reward quiet continuation. So when the plateau appears, the system does exactly what it has been trained to do: disengage. The mistake people make at this point is interpretation. They assume the plateau means they reached their limit. They assume it means they chose the wrong path. They assume it means they are not cut out for this. Those assumptions feel rational because the system is uncomfortable. But discomfort is not a verdict. It is a signal that reward has been removed. The plateau does not test your ability. It tests your conditioning. It asks one question. What happens when I keep going and nothing exciting happens? If the answer has always been, I stop, then stopping will feel inevitable. If the answer has occasionally been, nothing bad happens, then continuing becomes possible. The difference between these two answers is not belief. It is evidence. This is why people who have mastered one difficult thing often find it easier to master another. They are not more motivated. Their system has learned that plateaus are not threats. They do not enjoy the plateau, they simply tolerate it. That tolerance changes everything. At the plateau, action must decouple from feeling. This is the first moment where identity matters more than interest. If identity predicts I am someone who continues even when it is boring, action flows. If identity predicts I am someone who acts when it feels right, action stalls. Again, this is not self-talk, it is expectation. The plateau is where expectations collide with reality, and because expectations shape emotion before thought, most people never realize they are failing a test they did not know existed. They think they lost motivation. In reality, they reached the first phase where motivation was no longer provided. That phase is unavoidable. If you cannot operate there, you cannot reach depth. Not because you are incapable, but because your system was never trained for that environment. The plateau does not block progress. It selects for systems that can function without immediate payoff. That selection happens silently, every time. Once you see this, the pattern becomes clear. Beginners chase excitement. Masters tolerate neutrality. The difference is not desire, it is adaptation. And adaptation does not come from understanding the plateau. It comes from repeated exposure to it without retreat. But exposure alone is not enough. How you expose the system matters. If the exposure is overwhelming, the system learns avoidance. If the exposure is minimal and survivable, the system learns tolerance. This is where most people go wrong. They think the solution to the plateau is to push harder. It is not. The solution is to change what continuing looks like. Before we define that precisely, one final illusion must be dismantled. The idea that discipline is a moral trait possessed by certain people and not others. In the next chapter, you will see why discipline is not a virtue, why willpower is unreliable by design, and how persistence emerges as a side effect of neural adaptation rather than personal strength. Chapter 8. Discipline is not a virtue, it is an after effect. Discipline is usually described as a personal quality. Some people have it, others don't. Those who succeed are disciplined. Those who quit are not. This framing is so common that it feels self-evident. It is also wrong. Discipline is not a cause of consistent action. It is a description applied after consistent action already exists. When you observe someone who works steadily without drama, it is tempting to assume they possess an internal strength that others lack. But what you are seeing is not force, it is alignment. Their system is not fighting itself. Action does not feel heroic because it is not being taken against resistance. Resistance has already been reduced through adaptation. This is why discipline appears stable from the outside and invisible from the inside. People who are described as disciplined do not experience themselves as constantly pushing. They experience continuation as normal. This distinction matters because it exposes the error behind willpower-based advice. Willpower is not a resource you can reliably draw from. It is an emergency override. It exists to handle rare conflicts, not to power daily behavior. Using willpower to sustain long-term effort is like using adrenaline to power a factory. It works briefly and then causes damage. The brain is not designed to operate that way. When people attempt to build discipline by forcing themselves through discomfort repeatedly, they often produce the opposite effect. Effort becomes associated with strain, tension, and self-coercion. The system learns that action equals threat. Resistance increases, not decreases. Over time, even small tasks trigger avoidance. This is why many highly conscientious people burn out. They mistake endurance for progress. They accumulate effort without adaptation. Discipline without adaptation is brittle. Real persistence emerges only when the system no longer interprets effort as dangerous. That change does not happen through resolve. It happens through exposure calibrated to the system's tolerance. This is the missing piece in most discussions of discipline. People focus on output, how much they do, how long they work, how intense they push. The system focuses on experience, what action feels like. If action consistently feels aversive, the system predicts harm. If action feels neutral, the system allows it. If action feels rewarding, the system seeks it. The goal is not to make action pleasurable. That would reintroduce dependence on reward. The goal is to make action survivable without reward. Neutrality is the target state. This is why people who truly have discipline often describe their work as boring, not painful, not exhilarating, just ordinary. Boredom is not the enemy. Boredom is a sign that the system is no longer demanding stimulation to continue. Most people never reach this state because they interpret boredom as a signal to stop. They confuse lack of excitement with lack of value, so they flee. And every time they flee, they reinforce the belief that action requires feeling good. This creates a vicious loop. Effort feels bad, stop, relief. Effort feels worse next time. Eventually, discipline feels impossible, not because the person lacks strength, but because their system has been trained to resist. This is why discipline cannot be installed through advice. You cannot tell a system to tolerate discomfort. You can only show it repeatedly that discomfort does not lead to harm. Once the system learns that, discipline emerges automatically, not as a trait, as a side effect. This reframes the entire problem. The question is no longer, how do I become more disciplined? The question becomes, how do I train my system to stop treating low-reward effort as a threat? That question has a concrete answer. It does not involve motivation. It does not involve beliefs. It does not involve personality. It involves a specific circuit that activates when you do something you do not want to do, and that circuit strengthens only under one condition, when it is activated and the system survives. Avoiding discomfort weakens it. Excessive forcing damages it. Most people do one or the other. To proceed, you need to understand exactly what this circuit is, how it functions, and why it determines whether you persist or withdraw when reward disappears. In the next chapter, you will be introduced to the specific neural system that governs persistence under aversion, the one that strengthens when you continue without wanting to, and atrophies when you avoid discomfort. Chapter 9. The circuit that decides whether you continue. When reward disappears, only one thing determines whether you keep going or stop. Not intelligence, not values, not how much you want the result. A specific control circuit becomes active precisely at the moment you feel resistance. This circuit does not activate when tasks are easy. It does not activate when you are excited. It does not activate when you are curious or motivated. It activates only when there is conflict between intention and impulse, when part of you wants to stop and action would require effort without immediate payoff. Most people live their entire lives without realizing that this circuit exists, let alone training it. And because it is untrained, it decides everything. The problem is not that people avoid hard things. The problem is that they avoid the exact sensation that would strengthen the system responsible for persistence. The moment discomfort appears, the system is given an escape route. Distraction, novelty, rationalization, postponement. Each escape feels harmless. Each one reduces tension. Each one teaches the same lesson. Stopping works. The brain is not learning concepts here. It is learning probabilities. It is learning that when resistance appears, withdrawal restores balance. Energy returns. Discomfort fades. Certainty comes back. This lesson is reinforced not once, but thousands of times. Over years, the system becomes extremely efficient at exiting effort. The threshold for withdrawal drops. What once required intense discomfort now triggers avoidance at the slightest friction. This is how people become fragile without realizing it. Not emotionally fragile, operationally fragile. Small obstacles feel heavy. Minor boredom feels unbearable. Any plateau feels like a signal to abort. From the outside, this looks like lack of discipline. From the inside, it feels like self-preservation. The circuit responsible for acting under aversion has atrophied. This circuit does not weaken because of failure. It weakens because of avoidance, and it strengthens only one way, by being activated and not followed by escape. That is the uncomfortable truth most people miss. You do not build persistence by succeeding. You build it by continuing briefly when stopping would feel better. The problem is that people misunderstand what continuing should look like. They assume it means pushing hard, grinding, forcing themselves far beyond comfort, powering through resistance. That approach is not training, it is injury. When effort exceeds tolerance by too much, the system registers threat. Stress spikes, aversion increases. The brain associates action with danger. Avoidance becomes stronger. This is why extreme discipline strategies fail. They produce short-term compliance and long-term resistance. On the other side, stopping immediately at the first sign of discomfort also fails. It teaches the system that aversion is intolerable and must be escaped. Both extremes reinforce the same prediction. Effort is dangerous. The solution is neither quitting nor forcing. The solution is calibrated continuation. Continuation that is small enough to be survivable, but real enough to violate the old rule. This is the missing middle path. When the urge to stop appears, that is not a problem. That is the training signal. That is the exact moment the circuit comes online. Most people treat that moment as a verdict. They assume it means something is wrong. They obey it automatically. But that impulse is not a command. It is a threshold. If you stop exactly at that point, the system learns nothing new. The old prediction survives intact. If you push far beyond it, the system panics and learns the wrong lesson. But if you move just past it, something different happens. The system experiences effort without catastrophe. It experiences discomfort without entrapment. It experiences continuation without loss of control. That experience is rare, and because it is rare, it is powerful. Each time it happens, the system updates slightly, not consciously, not emotionally, statistically. It learns that the impulse to stop is not always accurate, that discomfort does not always require escape, that continuing a bit does not lead to harm. Over time, those small updates accumulate. The threshold shifts. What once felt intolerable becomes manageable. What once triggered immediate withdrawal now produces only mild resistance. Eventually, the impulse to stop weakens, not because you suppress it, but because the system no longer predicts danger. This is how persistence is built, not through motivation, not through discipline, through repeated exposure to low-level aversion that ends safely. The most important detail is intentional stopping. After you extend slightly, you stop on purpose. This prevents the system from feeling trapped. It preserves agency. It ensures that continuation is associated with control, not coercion. The brain learns a critical pattern. I can continue and I can stop. That pattern dissolves fear. Without it, effort always feels like a cliff. Once you start, you fear you won't be able to stop. Avoidance becomes the safer option. Intentional stopping breaks that association. This is why most people never strengthen this circuit. They either stop too early or force themselves too far. Both feel justified. Both fail. The correct stimulus is subtle, boring, unimpressive. And that is precisely why it works. This approach does not feel like growth. It feels almost insignificant, which is why people underestimate it. But the nervous system does not respond to drama. It responds to repetition. Each small extension past the impulse to stop is a repetition. Over weeks and months, those repetitions reshape identity at the deepest level, not the story of who you are, the expectation of what happens when effort continues. Eventually, something shifts. You stop needing to negotiate. You stop waiting to feel ready. You stop interpreting resistance as a signal to quit. Action becomes quieter, more neutral, less emotional. That is not loss of passion. That is stability. And stability is what makes depth possible. In the next chapter, you will see how repeated avoidance quietly trains the opposite response, how quitting becomes automatic over time, and why relief is the most dangerous reinforcement of all. Chapter 10. How the brain learns that quitting is the answer. The brain does not learn from intention. It learns from resolution. Every time discomfort appears, the system observes what ends the tension. Whatever produces relief becomes the solution. This is how quitting is trained, not as a conscious strategy, as a reflex. Most people assume that stopping is neutral. They believe it simply pauses progress. In reality, stopping is active training. It teaches the system what to do next time the same signal appears. And the signal is always the same: resistance, boredom, uncertainty, effort without reward. When that signal appears and withdrawal follows, the system experiences immediate relief. Cognitive load drops, emotional tension decreases, stimulation often returns through distraction. Relief is powerful reinforcement, not because it feels good, but because it removes something unpleasant. This is negative reinforcement, and it is one of the fastest learning mechanisms in the nervous system. The system does not register what was lost by stopping. It registers what was gained, reduced discomfort, so the association strengthens. Discomfort, stop, relief. The next time discomfort appears, the system anticipates the relief in advance. Resistance shows up earlier. The urge to stop feels stronger. The narrative justification becomes faster and more convincing. This is how quitting becomes efficient. At first, the system requires significant discomfort to trigger withdrawal. Over time, the threshold drops. Minor friction produces the same response. What once felt manageable now feels heavy. What once felt heavy now feels unbearable. This is not because tasks became harder. It is because the system became better at escaping them. Each successful escape sharpens the prediction. The most damaging part is that this learning generalizes. The system does not store quitting as "this task was bad." It stores quitting as "this sensation means stop." So the response spreads. Resistance during reading triggers avoidance. Resistance during training triggers avoidance. Resistance during work triggers avoidance. Different domains, same sensation, same solution. This is why people often say, "I quit everything." They assume the problem is breadth of interest or lack of commitment. In reality, the system learned a universal rule. When effort feels uncomfortable, exit. Once this rule is installed, even starting becomes costly. The system predicts the full arc in advance. It knows novelty will fade. It knows discomfort will arrive. It knows stopping will be required to restore balance. So it resists initiation. This is how people become stuck without understanding why. They are not afraid of effort. They are trained to avoid it. And the training was not dramatic. It was mundane. Thousands of small exits. Each one justified, each one relieving. This is why insight alone does nothing. You can understand the cycle perfectly and still obey it. The system is not convinced by explanations. It is convinced by outcomes. As long as relief follows withdrawal, the loop remains intact. This is also why people who fail repeatedly often become harsher with themselves. They sense the pattern but misattribute the cause. They assume the solution is more pressure, so they force. Forcing creates a different kind of relief, the relief of finally stopping after strain. This is even more dangerous. The system learns that effort leads to exhaustion and that stopping is the only escape. The association deepens. Now effort is not just uncomfortable, it is threatening. At this stage, people describe themselves as burned out, unmotivated, or broken. In reality, they are highly trained, just trained in the wrong direction. To reverse this, the relief must be decoupled from quitting. This is the key principle. As long as stopping is what resolves discomfort, the system will choose it. You cannot argue with that logic. You have to interrupt it. This is where the small continuation protocol from the previous chapter matters. When discomfort appears and you extend slightly instead of stopping, something changes. Relief is delayed, not eliminated. Delayed. The system experiences discomfort and does not immediately escape. But because the extension is small, the discomfort remains tolerable. Then, when you stop intentionally, relief arrives. But it is no longer causally linked to avoidance. The system cannot clearly attribute relief to quitting. The sequence is broken. Over time, this weakens the association. Discomfort no longer guarantees escape. Stopping no longer feels like the only solution. At the same time, a new association forms. Discomfort, brief continuation, safety. This association is subtle, but it is transformative. It teaches the system that resistance does not require immediate withdrawal, that nothing catastrophic happens if you continue a bit, that control is preserved. As this learning accumulates, the system becomes less reactive. The urge to quit weakens. The sense of threat fades. Importantly, this process is slow. That is not a flaw. That is the mechanism. Rapid change would require overwhelming evidence, which would also create threat. Slow change allows the system to update without panic. This is why patience matters, not as a virtue, but as a requirement of plasticity. You are not trying to defeat quitting. You are trying to make it unnecessary. When the system no longer predicts relief from stopping, quitting loses its appeal. Eventually, something counterintuitive happens. Stopping begins to feel incomplete. Continuation feels cleaner. The system prefers finishing the small extension rather than escaping immediately. That is the beginning of a new default, not discipline, not motivation, but a reweighted prediction. This is how quitting stops being automatic, not because you resist it, because the system no longer expects it to solve anything. But to make this change reliable, one more distinction must be addressed. Not all effort should be treated the same, and not all systems respond identically. Before turning this into a repeatable protocol, one final complication must be understood. In the next chapter, you will see why this training must be calibrated differently for different nervous systems when pushing backfires and how to avoid turning persistence training into burnout. Chapter 11. When persistence training backfires, the same action that strengthens one system can damage another. This is where most persistence advice fails. Once people understand that continuation under discomfort is required, they overcorrect. They assume more exposure is always better. More effort, more pushing, less stopping. That assumption is dangerous. The nervous system does not reward effort itself. It responds to interpretation of effort, specifically whether effort is registered as controllable or threatening. If continuation feels like entrapment, the system does not adapt. It defends. This is why persistence trainings must be calibrated. The problem is not that people quit too easily. The problem is that when they don't quit, they often force. Forcing looks productive on the surface, Long sessions, high output, intensity, sacrifice. Internally, it feels very different. Control decreases. Exit options disappear. Fatigue accumulates. Stress rises. The system learns a new rule. When I continue, I lose autonomy. That rule is catastrophic. The brain tolerates discomfort far better than it tolerates loss of control. When effort is paired with a sense of being trapped, threat responses activate. Avoidance becomes stronger, not weaker. This is how people burn out while doing the right things. They did not fail because they lacked discipline. They failed because they trained the wrong association. Instead of learning I can continue and remain safe, the system learned continuation equals danger. The avoidance that follows is not weakness, it is protection. This is why the protocol described earlier includes intentional stopping. Stopping is not a reward, it is a safety signal. It tells the system that effort does not remove choice, that discomfort does not escalate indefinitely, that you are not trapped once you begin. Without this signal, the system cannot relax. Most people skip this detail. They think stopping after extending means they failed, so they keep going longer than they should. That mistake alone can undo weeks of progress. Persistence training is not about how long you last. It is about how the system interprets the experience. Short, controlled exposures produce adaptation. Long, forced exposures produce avoidance. This distinction becomes even more important when considering individual differences. Some nervous systems have higher baseline friction. They fatigue faster. They regulate attention differently. They experience effort as more costly. For these systems, persistence training must be even more precise. Pushing too hard does not build strength. It builds shame. When effort exceeds capacity, failure feels personal. The system does not register, "This was too much." It registers, "I am incapable." That belief is not verbal, it is implicit, and once installed, it is extremely difficult to remove. This is why the goal is not to endure discomfort. It is to normalize it. Normalization happens only when discomfort appears and resolves without drama. No collapse, no triumph, no story, just exposure, continuation, and return to baseline. That quiet resolution is what the system needs. This also explains why tracking effort in dramatic ways backfires. Celebrating grinding, glorifying suffering, or framing persistence as heroic all amplify threat. The system does not want to be heroic, it wants to be safe. Safety does not mean comfort, it means predictability and control. When continuation becomes predictable and controllable, the system stops resisting it. This is also where many people with attention regulation differences get misdiagnosed. They are told to try harder, focus more, push through. Those strategies fail because they increase cost without increasing control. The result is not discipline, it is shutdown. For these systems, persistence must be supported by structure, time limits, clear boundaries, environmental constraints, external scaffolding, not because they are weak, because their cost curve is steeper. Training must match architecture. The universal rule remains the same. Adaptation happens at the edge of avoidance, but the location of that edge varies. Ignoring that variation turns a useful method into a damaging one. The signal that training is working is subtle. Resistance appears but does not escalate. Discomfort is present but does not spike. After stopping, relief is mild, not euphoric. That last detail matters. If stopping produces a dopamine spike, the system is still pairing relief with withdrawal. The loop remains intact. The goal is neutrality. Effort feels plain. Stopping feels plain. Continuation feels unremarkable. This is the state where identity changes, not because you proved something to yourself, but because the system no longer flags effort as exceptional. When people ask, "How do I know if I'm doing this right?" the answer is simple. If you feel heroic, you are doing too much. If you feel ashamed, you are doing too much. If you feel bored and slightly resistant, you are in the right zone. That zone is not impressive, but it is where permanence is built. Once this calibration is understood, the method can be applied safely and repeatedly, without burnout, without collapse, without self-coercion. At that point, persistence stops being a fight. It becomes a background capability. But one more obstacle remains. Even when effort is calibrated correctly, most people sabotage the process through their environment. They expose their nervous system to constant stimulation and then wonder why neutrality feels unbearable. Before this training can stabilize, that interference must be addressed. In the next chapter, you will understand how constant stimulation destroys tolerance for boredom, why modern environments sabotage persistence by default, and how to remove just enough noise to let this training actually work. Chapter 12. Why boredom became intolerable. The nervous system you are trying to retrain does not exist in isolation. It is embedded in an environment that constantly interferes with adaptation. Most people assume their difficulty with persistence comes from internal weakness. In reality, their tolerance has been systematically eroded by external conditions. The modern environment delivers stimulation with almost no cost. Novelty is instant. Relief is immediate. Attention is fragmented by default. This recalibrates the system's baseline. When stimulation is always available, neutrality feels like deprivation. When reward is constant, silence feels threatening. When effort competes with effortless relief, effort loses. This is not because the task is too hard. It is because the comparison is unfair. Your nervous system evolved to tolerate boredom because boredom used to be common. It signaled waiting, scanning, low-level effort. It was not dangerous. Now boredom signals something else. The absence of stimulation in an environment where stimulation is expected. The system interprets that absence as loss. This changes how effort feels. Deep work does not just require energy. It requires withholding relief. Phones, tabs, music, notifications, background noise. These are not neutral. They constantly offer escape. Every time you resist the task, the system sees an exit. That exit weakens tolerance even if you do not take it. This is why persistence training often fails, even when the protocol is correct. The person extends slightly past resistance, but their environment keeps promising relief. The system remains tense. Neutrality never arrives. The solution is not asceticism. It is not eliminating pleasure. It is not dopamine detox. Those approaches fail because they attack stimulation globally instead of locally. What matters is contextual control. During the period of effort, relief must be unavailable, not forever, not dramatically, just long enough for the system to experience effort without interruption. This is how boredom is reconditioned. When the task is the only available stimulus, boredom loses its threat. There is nothing to escape into. The system stops scanning for exits and settles. This settling is not pleasure, it is acceptance, and acceptance is the gateway to depth. Most people never experience this state because they never remove alternatives. They sit down to work while their phone is nearby, their browser is open, music is playing, notifications are active. Their system is constantly negotiating. Should I stay or should I go? That negotiation is exhausting. It amplifies resistance. It makes effort feel heavier than it actually is. When alternatives are removed, the negotiation ends. The system stops asking whether it should escape, because escape is not an option. It redirects energy inward. This is not discipline, it is constraint. Constraint simplifies the energy equation. The mistake people make is trying to increase effort while leaving the environment unchanged. That forces the system to fight temptation continuously. Continuous inhibition is unsustainable. The correct approach is to design environments where inhibition is unnecessary. No phone within reach, no background stimulation, no parallel rewards, not permanently, only during the effort window. This allows the persistent circuit trained in earlier chapters to operate without interference. Discomfort appears. You extend slightly. Nothing interrupts. You stop intentionally. The loop completes cleanly. Over time, something shifts. Boredom stops escalating. Resistance flattens instead of spikes. Effort becomes quieter. This is not because the task became easier. It is because the system is no longer being pulled in multiple directions. Importantly, this does not reduce creativity or curiosity. It preserves them. Curiosity is volatile. It needs boundaries to be useful. Without boundaries, it scatters. With boundaries, it deepens. This is why people often report that their best thinking happens when stimulation is removed. Not because they are inspired, but because their system finally stops fragmenting attention. Boredom is not the enemy of progress. It is the condition that allows progress to consolidate. Once boredom is tolerated, the plateau stops feeling suffocating. It becomes a background state, something you move through rather than escape. This is the final environmental requirement for persistence training to work. Without it, every effort competes with relief. With it, effort becomes the default. At this point, the system has everything it needs: calibrated continuation, intentional stopping, and a quiet environment. But one more misconception remains. Many people believe that if they struggle more than others, something is wrong with them. They assume their system is defective. That assumption is not only false, it is dangerous, because some systems are not broken. They are simply built differently. In the next chapter, you will understand why some nervous systems require different scaffolding, how ADHD changes the cost structure of effort, and how to train persistence without turning difference into damage. Chapter 13. When force fails, because the system is different. Up to this point, the book has described how persistence is trained by continuing slightly past the impulse to stop in a controlled environment without overwhelming the system. For many people, this works directly. For others, applying the same approach produces a different outcome: exhaustion, frustration, or collapse. This difference is not explained by motivation or character. It is explained by cost structure. Not all systems pay the same price to initiate and sustain effort. Some systems experience resistance primarily at the point where reward disappears. Others experience resistance before action even begins. For these systems, the cost of entry is high. The mistake is treating these two architectures as identical. When entry cost is low, persistence training is about tolerating boredom and flatness. When entry cost is high, persistence training must be preceded by friction reduction. If you ignore this distinction, force replaces calibration. Force feels productive. It looks like effort, but it teaches the wrong lesson. The system does not learn "I can continue." It learns "starting drains me." That lesson poisons everything that follows. You can recognize a high entry cost system by its patterns. The person does not resist because the task is boring. They resist because the task feels amorphous. Time stretches. Scope feels undefined. The moment they begin, mental load spikes. They do not feel lazy. They feel overloaded. Under these conditions, asking the system to push a bit more is like adding weight to a structure whose foundation is unstable. The collapse that follows is predictable. This is why persistence advice often harms the people who need it most. The advice assumes that resistance appears after engagement. For high entry cost systems, resistance appears at the threshold, before the first step. The correct intervention here is not more tolerance. It is structural clarity. Before training the circuit that acts under aversion, the system must be able to enter the task without triggering overload. This requires changing the interface between the person and the work. The first requirement is bounded time. Open-ended effort is expensive. When the system cannot predict when effort will end, it assumes the worst. Stress rises, avoidance appears. Clear time limits collapse uncertainty. Not work until you're done, but work for 15 minutes. Time-limited containers lower the perceived cost of entry. The system can tolerate effort when it knows the exit in advance. The second requirement is visible scope. Abstract goals are heavy. Study, write, improve, learn, provide no anchor. The system cannot estimate cost, so it inflates it. Concrete actions reduce load. Not work on the project, but open the file and read the last paragraph. When the next action is explicit and small, entry becomes possible. The third requirement is external anchoring. Some systems stabilize attention internally, others require external reference points. This is not a deficit, it is a design difference. External anchors can be physical presence, visible timers, checklists, or shared accountability. They serve one function, keeping the system oriented in time and space. Without anchors, attention drifts, and effort feels uncontained. With anchors, effort feels localized. The fourth requirement is immediate feedback, not reward. Feedback. The system needs confirmation that action is happening. This can be as simple as checking a box, crossing a line, or marking progress visually. Feedback reduces uncertainty. Reduced uncertainty lowers cost. These adjustments do not replace persistence training. They make it possible. Once entry cost is reduced, the work changes. Now resistance appears where it should, at the point where reward disappears. Only then does the continuation protocol apply. This sequencing matters. Trying to train tolerance before reducing entry friction produces shame. The system cannot comply, so it concludes it is incapable. That conclusion is not cognitive, it is learned. And learned incapacity is far harder to undo than learned avoidance. This is why architecture must be respected. The goal is not to turn every system into the same shape. The goal is to create conditions where the same training can operate. When structure precedes force, persistence becomes available. When force precedes structure, collapse is guaranteed. Once the interface is corrected, something important happens. Effort no longer feels like falling into chaos. It feels like stepping into a container. Within that container, boredom appears, flatness appears, resistance appears. Now and only now, the system can learn that continuing slightly past resistance is safe. The identity shift that follows is different. It is not "I can push through anything." It is "I can enter, stay briefly, and exit without damage." That identity is sustainable. Over time, containers can expand, time limits can grow, scope can widen, anchors can loosen, but they must loosen gradually. The mistake is removing structure too early, as if needing it were a flaw. Structure is not a crutch, it is scaffolding. Scaffolding is removed after the building stands, not before. When applied correctly, this approach produces a quiet but profound change. Initiation becomes easier, resistance becomes clearer, continuation becomes trainable. The system stops confusing overload with boredom and boredom with danger. At that point, persistence is no longer a battle against the self. It becomes a skill applied within a compatible architecture. That distinction determines whether this book becomes transformative or harmful. Respecting architecture is not lowering standards. It is the only way standards can be met. In the next chapter, you will see how constant stimulation interferes with all of this, why relief-seeking erodes tolerance at the deepest level, and how to perform a functional reset without turning life into deprivation. Chapter 14. Why Relief-Seeking Destroys Tolerance. By this point, the mechanics of persistence should be clear. Continuation fails not because effort is impossible, but because the system has been trained to escape the moment effort becomes unrewarding. The previous chapter showed how this training happens internally and how architecture and structure determine whether persistence can even begin. What remains is the most underestimated force sabotaging the entire process: relief-seeking. Relief-seeking is not indulgence. It is not weakness. It is a learned response to discomfort. Whenever effort produces tension and that tension is resolved by stimulation, the system updates a simple rule: discomfort requires escape. This update happens regardless of intent. You can believe deeply in growth, discipline, or mastery. If relief reliably follows withdrawal, the system will prioritize relief. The modern environment makes this automatic. Stimulation is constant, portable, and frictionless. Discomfort no longer needs to be endured, even briefly. The moment resistance appears, relief is available. This availability fundamentally alters tolerance. Tolerance does not collapse because effort is harder than before. It collapses because relief is easier than ever. When relief is immediate, discomfort never resolves naturally. It is always interrupted. The system never learns that effort can stabilize on its own. This is critical. Discomfort has a natural curve. If not interrupted, it rises, plateaus, and then fades. The system learns this only through exposure. Relief-seeking cuts the curve short. Every interruption teaches the system that discomfort is dangerous and must be eliminated immediately. Over time, even small discomfort feels urgent. This is why boredom feels suffocating, not because boredom is intense, but because the system has never stayed with it long enough to learn that nothing happens. Relief-seeking also distorts comparison. Effort is evaluated against stimulation, not against baseline. When the baseline is saturated with intensity, neutrality feels like loss. This is not because effort is worse. It is because the reference point has shifted. As long as effort competes with stimulation, effort will lose. The solution is not removing pleasure from life. That mistake leads to deprivation, rebellion, and eventual collapse. The solution is contextual deprivation. Relief must be unavailable during effort, not permanently, not globally, only within the container where persistence is being trained. This distinction matters. If stimulation is removed entirely, the system panics. If stimulation is delayed contextually, the system adapts. During the effort window, relief options must be eliminated. No phone within reach. No background noise designed to entertain. No parallel rewards. Not because these are bad, but because they interfere with learning. The system cannot learn tolerance if it knows escape is one. Movement away. When relief is unavailable, something subtle happens. Discomfort loses urgency. Attention stabilizes. The system stops scanning for exits. This is often misinterpreted as getting into flow. It is not flow, it is settling. Settling is quieter than flow. Less exciting, more stable. Settling is what allows persistence to accumulate. Once the system settles, boredom changes character. It stops feeling like deprivation and starts feeling like emptiness. And emptiness is not painful, it is neutral. Neutrality is the state where deep work becomes possible. This is why people often report that the hardest part is starting without stimulation, but once they are in, things feel manageable. Nothing magical happened. The system simply stopped oscillating between effort and escape. This is also why partial relief is dangerous. Music, constant background input, intermittent checking. These keep the system half activated. Discomfort never resolves. Tension remains. Chronic low-grade tension is far more aversive than brief discomfort. The system learns to hate the task, not because the task is bad, but because the environment prevented resolution. The rule is simple. Either allow discomfort to resolve, or it will accumulate. Relief-seeking prevents resolution. This is the reason persistence training often feels impossible in stimulating environments. The system is being pulled in two directions at once. Remove the pull, and effort simplifies. This does not mean effort becomes enjoyable. It means effort becomes tolerable, and tolerance is sufficient. Once tolerance is established, something counterintuitive happens. Stimulation becomes less necessary. The system no longer needs constant relief because it is no longer constantly distressed. Attention becomes steadier. Distraction loses urgency. This is not discipline, it is recalibration. The system relearns its natural baseline. This recalibration cannot be achieved through abstinence alone. It must be paired with effort. Removing stimulation without effort produces restlessness. Effort without removing stimulation produces fragmentation. Together, they retrain tolerance. At this stage of the book, all major variables are now aligned. The circuit that allows continuation has been identified and trained. Entry cost has been reduced through structure. Relief-seeking has been constrained contextually. What remains is to turn this into a long-term identity shift, not through intensity, through repetition over time. That final step is where most people fail, not because they lack understanding, but because they do not commit to a long enough horizon for the system to update fully. In the next chapter, you will see how to turn these mechanisms into a multi-month protocol, why identity only updates after sustained exposure, and how to design inputs so the outcome becomes inevitable rather than aspirational. Chapter 15. Why identity only changes after sustained exposure. By now, the mechanics are complete. You know why continuation collapses. You know which circuit must be trained. You know how to calibrate effort, reduce entry cost, and constrain relief. And yet, even with everything aligned, one mistake can still invalidate the entire process. Expecting identity to update quickly. Identity does not change because something makes sense. It changes because the system runs out of reasons to predict the old outcome. This takes time, not because learning is slow, but because identity is conservative. Identity exists to stabilize behavior. If it updated rapidly, the system would be volatile. It would overreact to noise. So it waits. It aggregates. It averages. This is why insight feels powerful but fades. Insight is a single data point. Identity requires a data set. Most people quit the process at this stage, not because it is hard, but because nothing dramatic happens. Action feels quieter. Resistance is lower, but there is no moment of revelation, no emotional payoff, no sense of "I've changed." So they assume nothing is happening. This assumption is incorrect. The system is updating, but it updates implicitly. Each time you enter the task without overload, that is data. Each time you continue briefly past resistance, that is data. Each time discomfort resolves without escape, that is data. Individually, these events feel insignificant. Collectively, they rewrite prediction. But the rewrite only occurs when the dataset becomes undeniable. This is why time matters. Identity does not respond to intensity. It responds to consistency across contexts. A single heroic month does less than 6 quiet months. Not because effort was lower, but because variability was lower. The system asks a simple question: is this always how it goes now? Only when the answer becomes yes does identity shift. This is also why breaks must be handled carefully. Missing a day is not harmful. Resetting the pattern is. The system does not punish gaps. It punishes volatility. Consistency beats streaks. Predictability beats passion. This reframes commitment. Commitment is not emotional attachment to a goal. It is agreement to continue the input regardless of internal state. You are not committing to success. You are committing to exposure. This is why outcomes are indirect. If you chase outcomes, you reintroduce reward dependence. If you chase inputs, outcomes emerge as side effects. This is the core of inevitability. When inputs are stable, the system stops asking whether to continue. Continuation becomes the background condition. At that point, identity shifts without announcement. You notice it only in hindsight. You realize that starting feels easier, that boredom no longer alarms you, that stopping feels incomplete, not because you forced yourself, but because the system now predicts a different arc. This is why people often say, "I don't know when it changed, it just did." That is the correct experience. Identity does not flip, it drifts. The danger at this stage is impatience. Impatience leads to escalation. Escalation leads to force. Force reintroduces threat. The correct posture is boring reliability. Same container, same rules, same extension past resistance, same intentional stop, week after week. This is not impressive. It is effective. At this point, the role of belief becomes clear. Belief does not initiate change. Belief confirms it after the fact. Once the system has enough evidence, belief updates automatically. Confidence appears late. Trying to manufacture confidence early is counterproductive. It pressures the system to perform before it has adapted. Let confidence lag. Action is the interface with reality. Belief is the receipt. The final identity that emerges from this process is not "I am disciplined." That identity is fragile. The real identity is simpler. I continue. Not heroically, not emotionally, continuously. This identity does not depend on mood, novelty, or motivation. It is operational, and once it is installed, most of the struggle described in the early chapters disappears. Not because life becomes easier, but because the system stops fighting itself. What remains is to formalize this into a protocol long enough to complete the transition. That protocol is not complex, but it must be followed long enough to become undeniable. In the next chapter, you will see the complete multi-month protocol laid out clearly: how to choose the right domain, how to measure inputs instead of outcomes, and how to make continuation inevitable rather than aspirational. Chapter 16. The Identity of Continuity. At the end of this process, nothing dramatic happens. There is no surge of motivation, no permanent confidence, no sense of arrival. What changes is quieter and far more consequential. The system stops asking whether to continue. That is the real outcome. Up to this point, continuation required negotiation. Each session began with internal debate. Each plateau triggered evaluation. Each dip in reward demanded explanation. That friction is gone, not because effort became pleasurable, but because effort became expected. This is the identity of continuity. It is not "I am disciplined." It is not "I am consistent." It is not "I finally fixed myself." Those identities still depend on self-evaluation. The identity of continuity is simpler. When I start, I continue a little. When resistance appears, I extend slightly. When the container ends, I stop. No story, no justification, no drama. This identity is not aspirational. It is mechanical. It exists because the system now predicts a stable sequence: effort, tolerance, resolution. There is no longer a strong association between discomfort and escape. Relief is no longer the primary objective. The nervous system is no longer scanning for exits. As a result, boredom loses its authority. Boredom still exists. Resistance still appears. Flatness still happens. But none of these signals carry urgency. They are background noise, not commands. This is what people mistake for discipline. From the outside, it looks like willpower. From the inside, it feels like normalcy. That normalcy is the payoff. It is what allows depth to accumulate without strain. Skills compound quietly. Projects move forward without emotional spikes. Progress becomes something you notice only when you look back. This is also why choosing the right domain matters. The goal was never to pick the best interest. It was to pick one long enough to encounter the plateau repeatedly, not to master it, to live inside it. 6 months is not arbitrary. It is long enough for novelty to die completely, long enough for multiple plateaus to appear, long enough for identity to update beyond doubt. During this period, outcomes are irrelevant. You do not measure improvement. You do not track success. You track inputs. Did you enter the container? Did you extend slightly past resistance? Did you stop intentionally? That is the entire protocol. Anything else reintroduces reward dependence. The mistake most people make at this stage is optimization. They try to do more. They try to speed it up. They try to turn inevitability into performance. That impulse is the old system resurfacing. Ignore it. The system is already updating. It does not need to be impressed. What it needs is stability. Same rules, same limits, same behavior, day after day. If a day is missed, nothing breaks. If a week is missed, the pattern weakens. If the rules are changed constantly, identity never settles. This is not punishment. It is math. Identity is the average of behavior over time. Once the average shifts, everything else follows. At some point, without warning, you will notice something subtle. You will sit down and begin without friction. You will encounter resistance and not react to it. You will stop when planned without relief or guilt. And you will realize that the question, "Will I quit?" no longer makes sense. Not because you are better, because the system no longer predicts quitting as the solution. That is inevitability. You do not need to protect it. You do not need to believe in it. You only need to maintain the inputs that created it. If you do, the identity holds. If you stop supplying evidence, it fades. Not immediately, but eventually. This is not fragile. It is conditional, conditioned on behavior. The final correction is this. You were never a dabbler. You were never broken. You were never undisciplined. You were operating a system optimized for novelty in an environment saturated with relief, without ever training the one circuit that makes continuation possible. Once that circuit is trained, everything that felt personal reveals itself as mechanical, and once something is mechanical, it is no longer mysterious. You don't need motivation. You don't need belief. You don't need to try harder. You need to continue supplying the same inputs. Action is the only interface with reality. Beliefs don't change through thinking. They change through evidence. Consistency beats intensity. When the inputs are correct and repeated long enough, the outcome stops being a hope. It becomes inevitable. This is not the end. It is the point where effort stops being a question. Before you leave, do one simple thing. If this helped you see your behavior differently, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Not as support, as alignment. This content only matters if it is revisited, applied, and reinforced over time. Subscribing ensures the next inputs reach you without relying on motivation or memory. If you want inevitability, structure your environment accordingly. Then close this video and act.